Amazing. All right, I'm gonna take that as my cue to take it away. I'm going to share my screen really quickly for just a couple of moments to get this started. But it's always kind of funny to me doing closing talks because effectively you don't really need me anymore. This is like a super celebratory moment. You've created some amazing prototypes and visions of the future, and I'm so excited to see these end results. And basically I am the maybe last thing between you and a really long deserved nap. So here we are. I'm going to try and make this pretty quick and open it up and leave it mostly for questions and answers at the end about anything that you would like to talk about, design or IDEO, or what this talk ends up being about. And so the most suitable topic of conversation for today and for this moment and where you are in your design journey, I think, is actually about next steps, right? Like what comes next after this hackathon? You've designed a lot of things. You've hopefully gotten some sleep in between the 2 days. You've maybe made incredible friends and learned a lot by just doing and practicing design. And so this question of what comes next, I feel like is always a thing that's been in the back of your mind as you're going through the hackathon process. And here's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So in the next 45 minutes, we're going to creatively warm up together, get ourselves a little bit back into real human space, into a bit of a synthesis mindset maybe, and then spend a couple of minutes talking about what it looks like to be prototyping as we're right and asking questions as if we're wrong in terms of getting to next steps. And then I'll leave most of the time that we have for questions and answers, because I would really like to actually make this more of a dialogue and conversation and hear from you and what you're thinking. And so a little bit of a background on who I am. This text is very small. I'm happy to link my bio or put it somewhere else, but I am a designer at IDEO CoLab. And what we do there is we bring together ecosystems of organizations, some very large corporates, some nonprofits, and some academic institutions and startups and other groups, to design towards shared goals. So things and initiatives in an industry that are maybe too big for any one organization to do alone. For example, in the circular economy, it's really, really hard for any one particular company to maybe make a big sustainability move without knowing that they have the support and also the infrastructure and collaboration of a bunch of different design partners as well. And so that's what we do over at CoLab. My background is in mechanical engineering and venture design, and I started my career designing around emerging tech, so blockchain, Bitcoin, AI, all of the mixed, augmented, and virtual realities, and slowly have shifted into the more social design, human side of things. And I've worked on the future of food and finance and fashion and fertility and other words that don't begin with F. But the most interesting project by far that I've ever been proposed is designing a national holiday. Happy to talk about that later, and any of these other topics of conversation. A couple of side hustles, which, you know, reach out to me if you're interested in getting involved in any of these. But I'm an instructor and fellow of innovation at Harvard School of Engineering, and I facilitate a workshop based on bio-inspired design in Panama, and explore Asian American identity and what that means through traditional Chinese medicine, with actually the family business, Agape Healing in Chicago. And so come talk to me anytime you would like to nerd out about, you know, living life without plastic, frameworks for everyday things, chaos and game theory. I'm particularly fascinated by and pirate utopias. I don't claim to be an expert in any of these things. They're just things that are fascinating to me, and I would love to learn your point of view. But if you want to find me on the internet, I'm at Mamoni Valley on Instagram and Twitter, and I'll drop an email for me if you would like to reach out in other ways as well. So without further ado, we are going to creatively warm up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment. This may require a little bit of turning videos on just because it's more interesting that way. But if you don't feel like it, don't worry about it. We do not need to have videos on for this to happen. But I want you to grab a piece of paper. Oh my gosh, pieces of paper, physical, tangible things. What? Yes, grab a piece of paper or a Post-it, whatever you might have lying around. I'm not particularly you know, picky about what it is. If you really don't have a piece of paper lying around, a napkin will do. Or if you really want to do this on your phone, you can try doing it on your phone as well. But everybody have something tangible. You really just, I'm just looking for a physical object here. All right. If we all have these things, it's so nice holding a tangible object, you know, so long since we're all doing this over Zoom. All right, in the next 30 seconds, I want you to take this piece of paper I want you to put both hands behind your back. This is way more fun with your video on if you do this, but like it's totally fine. No pressure to turn on, just, you know, more engaging that way. Take this piece of paper, put it behind your back, and in 30 seconds, you are to sculpt a giraffe. Ready? Go. This is way harder than it looks. You get better at it over time, like there is definitely like a practice to it. What are we at? Got like 20 seconds left on the clock. Amazing. Oh, my piece of paper, definitely too small to do this. Sculpt a giraffe with a piece of paper or a Post-it or a napkin. You've got 10 seconds left on the clock. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, if you're brave enough, oh wow, that came out way worse than I expected. Hold your giraffe up to your camera. How did we do? How did we do? Amazing, beautiful giraffes all around, long necks, some llamas, some alpacas, some cranes. Michelle, that giraffe is amazing. All right, here we go. This is your opportunity to take a screenshot. This is the equivalent of now taking a selfie at a public event, and then you can put it on Instagram or your story, whatever. This is you know, this is the new reality we live in. All right, here we go. So creative warm-ups, super important things I think to do. Just to remember that we are still humans that exist, you know, from the neck and shoulder down, and there's still a joy and a beauty in making tangible things. And I encourage you to remember that there is a practice and there is an art of creating in 3D and still being able to have those moments of connection with each other as human beings. That's my piece about that, to do a little bit something fun in your meetings before you get right down to business. But back to original programming, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen again. Really would highly encourage, if you have any questions that come up while I'm going through this talk, or anything where you're like, you know what, I don't really know if I agree with you, please, please, please put it in the chat. I'll be looking out for that, and I'll also use that to start doing some Q&A at the end as well. So anytime there's something that makes you give pause, something that you're like, you know what, I super agree with that, or something where you're like, I would like to complicate this, drop it in the chat. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So starting off here, the human-centered design process, which I think some of you use some version of throughout the past 20 or 48 hours, we really say to start with desirability. And in this Venn diagram of desirability, feasibility, viability, and in the process of design thinking, trying to balance these different tensions between the things that humans want, what's possible in the world, and what's good for business. And so we say to start with desirability, to understand our user, to understand the people that we're designing for, and go about prototyping to understand feasibility. And you know, if we have time to actually get down into business models, we get into viability. And this, I'm starting here, is a bit of a reflection on maybe what happened in the past 48 hours, where you were designing for really sharp and challenging opportunity areas within health and education and inequality. And so in that process, in this framework, you maybe used some variation of brainstorming and prototyping and getting feedback. And what's amazing about this structure is that it's pretty cool that in the span of such a short amount of time, we're able to get to something tangible so fast and to experience a bit of a design arc, a bit of a design process in whole pretty quickly. And I think that's really magical. And it is an incredible tool in getting something from your head and your imagination align with the rest of your teammates, and then put something out there in the world that other people can understand, even though they weren't physically in the room or remotely in the room with you during this whole process. But this concept of ending right in the middle, ending right in this perfect intersection of desirability, feasibility, and viability is actually something that's really hard to translate into the real world. And this is maybe where real design work begins. This is maybe where we start to actually test after this hackathon and understand, where can we negotiate for the best opportunity between desirability, feasibility, and viability, because these three things are meant to hold each other in tension, and they're meant to help us figure out where is the best part to start implementing first? Where is the best piece to start translating this prototype into something that looks really real? And even though the ideal prototype is the perfect intersection between these factors, it is more looking like a tension rather than the intersection. And it's because reality does have tensions, right? Outside of the safety and imagination space and permission that's created inside of this amazing hackathon and this structure, when we start to zoom out and look at what does it look like to take some of these prototypes and put them out there into the real world to test them against reality, what starts to happen and what starts to break, and what do we need to start thinking about as designers and zooming out into the systems level to really understand what our next steps in terms of getting towards tangibility. And so I want to share a quick framework with you all. This is Larry Lessig's theory of the pathetic dot. Highly recommend you look this up to really understand where the history of this comes from. But I think that throughout time, this has still resonated. And the basic structure of this is this. You or whoever your user is trying to affect is this dot in the middle. I'm not really sure why it's called the pathetic dot, but consider this as the user. You have these four forces kind of coming in on the different sides affecting this dot, this user, this human being. And these four things, not all encompassing by these four things, but these very strong factors tend to be markets, what business is looking for, regulation, what legal or law allows you to do, infrastructure, which can be interpreted in a couple of different ways, right? It can be architecture, it can be technology, it can be the structures that we have in order to facilitate process and progress. And the last one is norms, social norms, the cultural things that we believe in to be true in terms of our society, a bit of the social contract that we maybe have. And so you may have come across some of these questions about these different forces affecting the feasibility of your prototype, and you maybe had to make some assumptions in order to make progress and move forward and be able to get to something finished in such a quick amount of time. That's awesome. And that's exactly what should be happening during that initial design phase, during that phase of just getting your ideas out there and going through this hackathon design process. But in these next steps, we really start to run into these questions and barriers, right? Of how far can the design process help us and take us through to regulation, to get us into markets that maybe don't exist, to change social norms and to change infrastructure. And throughout the years, there have been experts that have gotten really good at creating new types of design disciplines and new processes and strategies to start to solve some of these. But when you're starting out as a designer, you start to ask yourself this question, which is, what is really the role and responsibility of a designer when you're looking at these four different forces? Are we able to best use the design process and our own superpowers in knowing and understanding how to change social norms? Is it designing for behavior change? Is it designing new regulations and policies? Is it designing ways to convince people to get out there and vote, right? So it makes us ask this question that feels maybe a little bit uncomfortable. And you know what, I'm just gonna say it, like, it is uncomfortable. It is an uncomfortable question to sit in and ask what the design process is really good for. And it's okay, we're gonna sit in it for a little bit. There might be some potential existential crises ahead. And I think that's all right. And the bonus that I'll give for you here is that as a designer, imposter syndrome is really real. I still feel it. I feel it when I look at all of your amazing work and I'm like, oh man, brilliant. Wow, what an amazing idea. But imposter syndrome starts to go away a little bit when you are able to sit with these existential questions around design and start to get used to it and start to settle and feel that discomfort and understand how to work through it. And so I want to talk for a little bit about this concept of design and design. And what is the difference here between design and design? And it's in the capitalization of this letter D. If you Google it, lots of heated debate, highly recommend. It's a fascinating rabbit hole to dive into. But here's an excerpt about the evolution of design that I think sums up this concept pretty well. Fantastic book from Victor Margolin, very comprehensive, really, really, truly an epic. But he says, Margolin defined two kinds of design with a small d, which by his definition, what people have always created to satisfy needs and organize their environment, right? Things that you are naturally doing as a human being, responding to your environment as a designer. And design, with a capital D, his word for the official term associated with mass production and mass communication. And what I'll add to here is maybe a little bit of the capital D design industry that designers participate in. And so I'm curious what your thoughts actually are about this difference or this definition between big D capital design and small d design. And for you, you might be like, there's no difference. Like, what do you mean the difference between these two? That's totally okay as well. I'm gonna give you 60 seconds, drop it in the chat, and I'll read some of these out loud. And if there's nothing that shows up in the chat, I guess I'm just gonna have to go ahead with this monologue. So please give me something to work with. All right, 60 seconds on the clock. I'll see you in the chat. I feel like there should be elevator music for this. All right, here we go. Responses are coming in. Flexibility, amazing. Design is more hipster and forward thinking, amazing. Small D design, incredible. Keep them coming, y'all. There are no wrong answers to this, by the way. I'm not about to reveal like what is the right answer to this. Genuinely a little bit of a pulse check on what you're thinking here. Design with a big D is a more disciplined approach to every design. Absolutely. Design with a small d, more casual. Design with a big D, more official. Awesome. Big D design process, small d design visual. Totally. Oh, interesting. I like this. Design is like sketching and design is like high fidelity. Cool, cool, cool. So stages of the process. Very nice. Anything else? I'll give you like 10 seconds and then we'll move on. Big D design, finding ways to communicate efficiently to industries. Oh, I like this. Big D design, corporatized, small d, elastic. Ooh, that's attention, that's a beautiful one. Big D design, following all the rules. Big D design, bring abstract ideas into concrete solutions. I love it. I mean, all of these definitions, like totally valid. I don't think that anyone can actually say like, here's a definition of big D design and small d design and like leave it at that, right? That would be really difficult for anyone to like say this is the definition. Oh, I love this one. Design as a process and design as a prototype. I love it. Okay, so none of these are wrong. I just want to point out none of these that came out in the chat are wrong. I'm going to give you a little bit of my own understanding of these two dichotomies and how that translates to what next steps after this hackathon and how to continue the process looks like. And so I think that actually this big D, capital D design and small d design really starts to imply a false binary. And I think that that's really true. It is a false binary because for me, big capital D design and lowercase d design are actually two moments of realization that I've experienced as a designer throughout my career. And capital D design is really this moment that I first realized like, oh, wow, I can apply my craft to something in the world and change it to be something that I think is interesting or that I think should exist and should be out there. And this concept of, wow, I can change things within the system that I exist inside of, right? If I'm doing product design, I can make this water bottle a certain shape that I want to. If I'm making this app, I can set up this incentive mechanism inside to really make my users think in certain ways or click certain buttons and start to apply these UI principles that are going to make things really legible or start to guide the user into understanding these flows or go on this journey that's been planned out. And there was a second moment here where I realized the importance of small letter D design. And so we'll go with a little bit of a pause here and I'll stop sharing my screen and just think a little bit about story time. So after a couple of rounds of designing within the food system, which is related so much to the healthcare system and inequality, and in some ways education, there was a piece of me that was really struggling to understand and to sit in this uncomfort of, are the things that we're designing at this individual user level really going to work? I mean, I think that our relationship as individuals with food is really complicated. It starts from the moment that we're born, from the moment that we need to eat food, and it changes with maybe every meal that we eat, and it changes with every advertisement that we get, and every piece of information that we consume about what we're supposed to be putting inside of our bodies. And so with this tension, it's like, I kind of need to understand, like, would I be able to stress test a prototype that, you know, myself and my team came up with and truly be able to follow through? And I challenged myself to go 100 days without consuming any added sugar. So I'm gonna stop my screen. I'll go back in just a second. But what ended up happening here was, it felt a little bit strange to, you know, design products and services that I wasn't like 100% sure. I was like, oh yeah, this would work for myself. And so taking 100 days and stopping eating any added refined sugar was an empathy exercise to try and understand, like, what are the questions or what are the assumptions that I'm making about the food system and about changing people's habits around food that I just don't know or don't understand yet. And this shows up a lot in the work that we do at IDEO in design research and in the space of inspiration, right? We call this analogous inspiration or empathy exercises. You may have heard stories about visiting a pit crew during a NASCAR race to understand how emergency rooms and operating rooms and surgeons need to start to communicate with each other in really frantic situations, or shop-alongs and going around and following a person as they're going through the grocery store shopping to understand a little bit more about how they're making decisions the way that they're used to, and these really exercises to help understand another human being's experience a little bit more. And so this 100 days of not eating any added sugar was another one of these empathy exercises. And I've done different 100-day exercises before to get more empathy for the systems that I'm designing in. And so here's what I realized. It was just a rough 28 days of my life. Like the first 28 days, I think I just cried at the end of a couple of days because I was so angsty about, giving up refined sugar. And it was something that my body had become addicted to over the course of my life. And giving that up was a difficult process. But then it got really amazing. It got better afterwards. And then the last 60 some days was just this super amazing energy, skin cleared up, glowing complexion, all of the things people tell you that is going to happen when you give up sugar. But the biggest takeaway was that it was just really, really friggin' hard. My biggest takeaway from that whole experience and that project was designing for individuals and designing for users is crucial. And understanding their experience is super important, but even more so, designing for the system around them is imperative in setting them up for success. Even the most genius nudges that you can create for behavior change, the hardest change that you can create is the system that surrounds them, because I barely made it to day 28 of going without sugar without hitting a point where I was like, this is gonna be okay. I can make it through these 100 days. But to get to those 28 days of being miserable, of not eating added sugar, and then getting it to day 100, that came with a lot of privilege. That came with the privilege of working in an office that had healthy snacks, came with the privilege and luxury of having time to make meals for myself, came with the privilege of not eating or purchasing a lot of processed foods that had hidden added sugar inside of that, right? And so in designing for a user, in creating this moment where I really was considering the individual and the human, I also needed to figure out what the tools were to design for the system and to zoom out a little bit and understand that each of these prototypes that we're creating are, asking questions and doing the research to understand this individual, but also really needing to zoom out and understand the system that supports them as an individual and to start to create change there. And so I'm gonna go ahead and go back to screen sharing and do this annoying thing that I hate doing to people, which is reading a text out loud to you, but I'm gonna do it to highlight this particular excerpt. So this excerpt is from the book Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. I recommend it as a perspective and point of view to add to your understanding of design and how power and systems work. I ask you also to question the book and to challenge a lot of the perspectives offered in it. But the piece that I want to pull out from here and the point of view that I would like to pull out here is this particular one about poverty and inequality. So Gusani, who's one of the philosophers mentioned in this book a lot, observed ideas framed as being about poverty are more acceptable than ideas framed as being about inequality. The two ideas are related. I'm going to skip through a couple of things here to this quote. Poverty is essentially a question that you can address via charity, he said. A person of means seeing poverty can write a check and reduce that poverty. But inequality, Gosani said, you can't, because inequality is not about giving back. Inequality is about how you make the money that you're giving back in the first place. Inequality, he said, is about the nature of the system. To fight inequality means to change the system. For a privileged person, it means to look into one's own privilege. And he said, you cannot change it by yourself. You can change the system only together. With charity, essentially, if you have money, you can do a lot of things alone. So this book is full of hot takes like this. Recommend for that reason, but also recommend that you look and challenge some of these hot takes and think about where they come from. And for me, this book kind of put some words to this second moment of realization that I think I had as a designer around small d design. And it was really around this point of designing for inequality and realizing that there are some things about the system that design can't do for a designer individually on their own. And for me, the second moment of realization, small d design, was this realization of when you realize that your craft can't change everything, but you can use it to facilitate a process with others to change the system together. And this is where you start to ask the really interesting next steps and really interesting prototypes of what you do next after this initial hackathon and after this first thing that you do. So this is the second moment, but I want to be clear about something. I don't think that it's an either or, right? You're not really in this mode of like, I am a capital D designer and I am, you know, exerting and using my craft to do things in the world. And it's also not just I'm, you know, small d designer, like reacting to the system, changing the system together, trying to facilitate that process. And I'm still trying to understand like, which one is closer to your core as a human being, right? Like it probably is more of a concentric circle. Some things are coming in from, this is what I believe in, and this is the thing that I am going to really use to drive forward my design. And then this is the thing that supports my philosophy and my work and my practice. So let me know what you think in the chat, which one is more important to the center and identity of yourself as a designer. But really would love to know what this is, because still on a dialogue about it, still trying to figure this out. But this is still not quite the right division. Like this division of there's an internal, you know, maybe more like ego-driven design, and then an external, maybe more systems-driven design, still not quite right, right? And tactically, what does that mean? How does it show up in our work? We could maybe say, maybe, here's some thought starters, that capital D design is looking at craft. It's looking at your deliverables. It's looking at your scope of work. It's looking at your portfolio. And maybe we can consider smaller lowercase d design to be looking at our values that show up in our work, the process that we go on, scoping the work itself, who we agree to work with and what we agree to work on, and our philosophy that happens, right? And so maybe this divide is actually about the things that are tangible and the things that are intangible. Maybe this is about the practice versus the process. Maybe this is the continuous exploration of how we consider ourselves as designers and how we decide to show up in the world and inside of our work. But I think that even this division between capital D design and small d design is a little bit of a false binary and a bit of a small moment to think about where is fluidity in the design process and where is fluidity in the things that we create. And I think that it's actually a lot about prototyping as if you're right and asking questions as if you're wrong and repeating and going back and forth between these two modes continuously. So the design is something that's never finished. It's a process that you're going to keep on going in dialogue with yourself, with other designers, with other inputs in the world. And I think that it's a bit of a dance back and forth. So design to me and next steps is about figuring out what those next steps are in a dance between these two forces of hunger and humility. And I struggled with figuring out what this word is right here. I don't know if it's hunger. Chime in the chat if you think it should be something else. I tried out using hubris because it would sound nice next to humility, but it was going a little bit overboard. You know, pride maybe was more of the right answer to say here. But I think it is hunger. And the reason why I say that is it's a hunger to see yourself in your work, to see your values play out and exist out there in the world in a way that's more real than a prototype, in a way that's a little bit larger than life, in a way that's a legacy that you're leaving as a designer and a footprint onto the world. And this is a phrase that I've heard that I think is really poetic, which is like to use our role as designers to dip our hands into the stream of destiny. And it's super exciting when you see a product or something that you've created out there in the world and really being there. And I think it shows up in really big ways, right? It shows up in the ways where you're like, I made this prototype, I have an idea, and I want to put it out there, and you're kind of running the show. You are the co-founder, the entrepreneur, the designer, number one on the project. It goes out there, it does really well, you're really successful, and that's what's happening. I think that it also shows up in little ways too, right? The accessibility tags in our CSS, giving optionality to gender choices in designing onboarding screens, and using representative and diverse imagery, even in placeholder photos in prototypes. These are the little ways that we're able to put our own values and opinions and assumptions about the world into our design and into our work. But at the same time, I think that this hunger really needs to be balanced with humility, right? It's a dance between hunger and humility, but it's also a dance between prototyping and iterating. Always prototyping as if you're right, with the hunger to see what you want to see in the world out there, but balancing that with feedback and iteration, always asking those questions as if you're wrong. And so, in sum of all of that, here are some next steps tangibly for you when you're still in prototyping mode, when you are in this like super exciting but also exhausting and very emotional roller coaster of trying to get your initial ideas from this brain space out there into the world. Ask yourself these questions. What values are showing up in this work? What point of view is being put out into the world with this prototype? What have we created that is unseeable? How could this positively impact the world? And what's this team going to do next with all of the superpowers that are assembled here? And I think that these are really important questions to be asking yourselves, about the prototypes that you created after this weekend. Maybe take a nap, come back to this and look at it. But I think even more crucially, to get this out into the world, to carry forward some of your prototypes and to really see some of the change that they could have and positive impact that they could have out in the world. It's really important to start asking these questions. What questions are we not asking? Who did we forget to bring in as an expert or as a point of view? And I want to like asterisk this expert thing. Experts aren't necessarily just people who've written books or have PhDs or have any particular job title. Like, an expert is a person who also has just had a lived experience, and that life, you'll never be able to find someone who's a more expert than the particular situation or life that they've lived. What unintended consequences might manifest over time? What are all of the ways that this could go wrong? And this is something you do in iteration, not during the initial ideation, right? You want to be checking yourself after this beautiful blossoming of different ideas and brainstorming, and take this time now to do synthesis and to understand how to do better and how to iterate and get feedback. And then the last question to start asking yourselves also is, are we the right team to be doing this work? Is this actually the most efficient way to get it out in the world, or is there another team or other collaborators that you need to really bring on board? And so for me as a designer, I have a set of values that I'm trying to curate, that I'm testing against the world all the time, trying to figure out if it's going to reflect my beliefs, and balancing that hunger and humility between the work that I want to see that's out there in the world and the work that I know that I'm going to need so many other people involved to try and change the system in order to do some really, really impactful work that's out there down the line and start to unlock these massive, really complex, wicked problems that really are the most interesting questions to be asking. So I'm gonna turn it over to questions now. That's all I really have for y'all. I'm on the internet at Oh My Gong on Instagram and Twitter. I'll pretty much always respond to a DM. Email is sometimes great, sometimes not. But a small token of my appreciation, this swag bag for you, I'll drop it in the chat in just a second. And then as another takeaway, there are books that I recommend for designers who are interested in everything that was discussed today, as well as just things that are changing and have changed the ways that I've thought about the world and how to be a designer in it. And so feel free to check those out. Recommend me some of your favorites too. They definitely go into much more nuance about all of the points of view brought up today in this little bit of a closing talk. And I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can all look at each other. I really hope that you jump in with questions in the chat, or else we'll just sit and look at each other a little bit awkwardly for however much time we have left, and I'm really okay with that too. All right, questions. I'll take questions. If you don't give me questions, I just, I guess we'll move on to prizes. All right, into the chat, dropping a swag bag for y'all. Oh, Charles, thank you. Check that out. There's some fun things in there, things for work.